Thanks for coming. This recorded lecture is going to talk about Chapter 7, Love and Romantic Relationships. Follow along, please. When we talk about forming relationships, a good concept for us to use, a good concept for us to learn for other situations, but that can be taught well in this case, is social scripts. What is a social script? It's a commonly understood pattern of interaction that serves as a model of behavior in familiar situations. The key thing about a social script is it helps you enter into a new social interaction without having to reinvent it from scratch. You don't have to figure out what kind of situation you're in, decide how to act, decide what your role is in relation to other people. You have a script in mind, you slot the situation you're in into a preformed interaction space. Sort of, you already have an idea of how you're supposed to behave in this situation. This is a reassurance for people that their behavior is understandable and acceptable to others. Other people know about the script. A script is not something you have secretly. A script is something that is shared socially. Everybody understands, or you assume everybody understands how we behave with social scripts. You don't have to invent everything from scratch. When society is changing rapidly, or you've just moved to a new state or city or country, or there are new rules, or you're interacting with someone who doesn't seem to understand the situation that you're in, this can be quite disorienting and confusing because you think you know how to act, you are expecting other people to behave appropriately and modify it. Every situation is a little bit different, but you get a lot of the preliminaries out of the way. If you all understand, okay, I'm a customer, this is a store, you're the cashier. Basically, what's going to happen is I'm going to buy something, you're going to take my money, and our relationship is going to be very superficial. You get all that out of the way without ever having to say it, then you can walk through the details. You can be cheerful or not cheerful. You can make a special request, but everybody understands sort of the background of what's happening. And when you don't have it, it's confusing. Same goes for relationships. Now, when it comes to relationships, relationship formation, so starting relationships especially, we still have scripts, but they are becoming less clear as starting and building relationships is becoming more diverse. That is, there's more different kinds of situations and different kinds of relationships, so communicating about them has become more complicated, more difficult. How are they changing? Well, the dating system, we'll talk more about this a little bit later on, but we no longer have such a rigid pre-formulated system of dating that we had in this country in the last century. In addition, we have more people living together as a common stage of relationships. So the steps you go through now might or might not include living together, which is a very big decision, but is not automatic. So it has to be kind of negotiated and considered. We have more divorced and older single people in the dating market, in the mix-up. Some of them have children. So the kinds of things people are looking for in their relationships, the kind of relationships they want to have, are much more complicated by that set of differences. The technology that we have is constantly changing and changing very rapidly. So how we communicate, how we meet, how people arrange their ongoing relationships is changing in ways that usually increase the immediacy, but can be making other changes as well. Okay, so that's complicated background. The situation and the types of situations we're in are rapidly changing. Going to back up a little bit and talk about love. Love has different elements to it, different forms, and we're going to compare romantic and utilitarian love here. Why do we have love? Well, humans probably have love because we needed it for survival. That is, human babies, as we've discussed before, need all kinds of care and nurturing that the offspring and other species just don't. We made an evolutionary trade-off where we produce babies with giant heads, but in order to make a baby that is still a baby but has a giant brain, its body is very underdeveloped. So babies need tons of love and support or they will die. And that's the human condition. And the only way to get adults to reliably provide that love and caring from the point of view of evolution, how does evolution do this? It has a set of emotions that we could call love that makes parents love their children, probably extends to other people loving each other as well. Other people besides just parents take care of children. We've talked before about grandparents, other relatives, community members. So loving a child is probably the original love. We call love now a deep affection and concern for another person with whom one feels a strong emotional bond. You feel the bond is between you and that person, it's interactive. A particular form of love for adults is romantic love. That's passionate devotion and attraction that one person feels for another. So when we talk about types of relationships, one type of bond that people have, one type of deep affection that people have for each other is what we call romantic love. And it's an ideal. It's not a simple reality. It's something that lives in our culture, in our minds, as an ideal. Here we draw on the work of the sociologist Anne Swidler. She described the modern version of romantic love as mythical. That is an ideal characterized by some key traits. It's unambiguous and clear. There is no doubt when you're in love in the romantic sense, at least in the ideal sense. It is unique. You can't feel the same love for multiple people. And the idea like you have found the one person in the world who is for you, and it's permanent. It lasts forever. That's, again, an ideal. People prove and demonstrate their love at the same time by overcoming obstacles in the quest for love. So when somebody has to overcome obstacles, has to outcompete somebody else, has to fly around the world, has to do something dramatic to demonstrate this, they are both proving and demonstrating their love in a way that it reinforces it for both people involved. Now, our modern structure of marriage reinforces, or at least used to reinforce, this ideal. And that's because we expected, not that long ago, and some people still do, to have at a young age one single person about whom you would make a fateful choice to marry and stay together in loving harmony forever. So that's sort of the social embodiment of the ideal, the romantic ideal. We should acknowledge, historically speaking, that the idea that spouses would really love each other is a modern ideal. This is not the way humans always structured their families, certainly not in pre-modern societies where marriage was much more practical or economic or religious, and was not all about passionate love. Okay. On the flip side from romantic love is utilitarian love. This is more contemporary. It doesn't completely replace romantic love, but it's intention. It's about negotiation and communicating. It's not as romantic, but it is still love. We call it utilitarian love when it's the practical, rational dedication of one person to another based on a shared understanding and emotional commitment. This is much less cosmic, much more down to earth. This drives people to, like the person in the picture, consider the pros and cons of different partners, to make a list of all the qualities and things you're considering and identify what they really want from a relationship and decide whether or not this relationship is for you. It parallels the growth of rational science replacing irrational religion as a way of explaining the world, and also the spread of democracy instead of monarchy. We choose our leaders rationally instead of having them just be born leaders. We have science instead of religion as a way of explaining the world. Science is a rational system, a list of pros and cons in a way of all the evidence that we have, rather than a religious dogma or doctrine that is just handed down to us. So this goes along with all kinds of other elements of modernity, utilitarian love. Okay, so let's talk about these relationships that that humans make. We call them romantic relationships. They don't have to be super romantic. That's just the generic term we use for these paired up relationships. Mutually acknowledged, ongoing interactions with some degree of heightened affection and intensity. Okay, so this includes married and non-married relationships. It doesn't have to be sexual, but they usually include at least an anticipation of sexual interaction. We can't really be more precise about this because in modern relationships, there's not necessarily a fixed beginning or end. There's not a formal status, and they might not even be called the same thing. One person says, "This is my boyfriend." The other person says, they're not sure what they are, right? Or they say different things to different people. They might disagree depending on, where they are on their individual journey. Okay. Um, we refer we call the process of pairing up into these romantic relationships mate selection. And mate selection, even if you're not literally mating, we still call it mate selection. That's the process by which people choose each other for sexual or romantic relationships. How, among all the people in the world or all the people that meet each other, do relationships come about? A process of mate selection. Understanding this is very important. Mate selection is the building block of families. Families are very important, and the elements of mate selection will determine other social things like the level of inequality, inclusion or exclusion of certain groups, elements of the way families will interact for their whole lives. So if poor people marry rich people, if certain religious groups exclude other religious groups, if you have a process that leads you to have older men with younger women or vice versa, or same-sex people or whatever it is, that will change the way the relationships evolve. So all of these elements are greatly influenced by the process of mate selection. That's why we care about it so much. Okay. Let me go back to the system of dating. I realize the terminology is different. People still talk about dating. I'll mention that in a minute. But there was really a pretty fixed system of dating that we talk about in the middle of the last century, sort of back in this mythical, not traditional, but called traditional period around the 1950s that we keep talking about. It was so accepted and so commonly practiced, especially among middle-class people and people in college, that there was this survey that showed college women going on an average of 12 dates per month with 5 different men. So people were dating a lot, and it was normal and expected, and that's how they interacted largely. It came to be seen as traditional, but of course it was a recent invention. As we saw, it replaced courtship and so on had come earlier. Now, when people talk about dating, they usually talk about a date as a single event. Dating is a more stable relationship, but the language is less formal than it was, and so it's more up for negotiation. The scripts are not as clear as they once were. And technology has played a huge role in this. It's a little hard to identify how people literally meet, but when we talk about how do people meet, online dating, specifically dating online, is pretty big. About 20% of young adults met their current partner through online dating. That is not just interacting online, but specifically, through something like a dating app. This increases the number of people that people have access to when they're considering potential partners. It's especially important for people who are members of small groups or marginalized groups, where you can't just sort of walk into a bar or walk into a crowded room and find somebody who is like you or meets your criteria. The internet is great for that. It does promote utilitarian models. That is, once we have the metrics, we have the data, the app can list and rank people for you. And that's really utilitarian thinking. You're not looking for just a spark, but you're sorting and searching on a whole set of criteria: age, sex, race, weight, occupation, and whatever else. It tracks us into a utilitarian model of thinking. And there is a concern, and this is, hard to pin down whether or not this is a legitimate concern or not, that it reduces commitment. That is, if it's so easy to meet new people all the time, then maybe people will be reluctant to commit to the person right in front of them, because in the back of their mind, they're always thinking, yeah, but there's another person just a click away. So there is a concern that online dating reduces the amount of commitment, especially early in relationships. Whether that's good or bad, we can discuss. Okay. Now, specifically when we talk about college students, we want to pause for a minute to talk about hookup culture, the hookup scene. In the book, I talk about the work by Lisa Wade. This is that I will show you here. She studied hookup culture as in a social environment where people are engaging in that, people are living in that environment, whether they're engaging in hookups themselves or not. You see from the other research on the screen, more than a third of college students as of this survey about 10 years ago did not have any hookups by what they considered to be a hookup. And some people had, a lot, 10 or more hookups. That was a small number of people had that many. What do we mean by hookup? It's casual, sexual, or romantic, and does not include a commitment or exclusivity, implied commitment or exclusivity. The definition, again, is going to be somewhat subjective and vary. There's no fixed rule about this. It depends on the community and the norms in the place and time where people are. College students who do this, whatever this is, hookup culture, they're just as likely as those who don't to think of themselves as in a committed relationship or think of themselves as heading towards committed relationships. It is a way of meeting people. The difference between dating and hooking up is the expectation of sexual contact on the very first encounter. So in the case of the hookup, what you're dealing with often is people who have a sexual encounter before they get to know each other rather than the other way around. Okay. And then Lisa Wade, the sociologist, identifies this sort of interactional work that often goes on afterwards where people try to establish that it didn't mean anything. So you first have the hookup, then you communicate to each other what you mean to each other. And often that's about not meaning a lot to each other to sort of extricate themselves from the situation. Hooking up can be dangerous. It can be risky. It involves sexual contact between people who don't know each other very well. And those risks are accentuated by the role of alcohol and drugs when people are using those as well. It just makes the situation more dangerous. Okay. On the mate selection question is also the question of what are people looking for? What do they find attractive? Sociologists are interested in this because this helps us define norms, expectations, culture, power. There's a lot of elements to this concept of beauty that sociologists and historians and other scholars have been interested in for a long time. Sorry, my head is blocking the top of Barbie's. That's a historic Barbie doll. She doesn't look like that anymore. Okay. A beauty characteristic may be common, but that doesn't mean that its attraction is biological. That is, something may be considered a benchmark or an indicator of somebody being beautiful, and the fact that everybody seems to agree on that doesn't necessarily mean that it's natural or biological. We certainly have a lot of differences in what is considered attractive across time and place in different cultures and societies in different times. Many of the traits associated with attractiveness in modern Western society have nothing to do with health or reproductive fitness. So it's not as simple as people find beautiful the bodies of people who will produce healthy babies or something simple from an evolutionary point of view. It's definitely not that simple. So for example, the extremely skinny Barbie of the past was not particularly well suited to having healthy babies. Not impossible, but just not ideal. In some cases, what has been considered attractive by mainstream society has been so unhealthy that it's really just implausible that evolution would have produced it. People who are so, for example, so skinny that they're incapable of reproducing at that weight. So there are times when it just does not add up at all, and we really have to look to other social elements. I want to just stress, and I mentioned this the other day in class, the social constructedness of this is not gender neutral. The last slide I showed you a picture of Barbie. When we talk about beauty and beauty standards, we're often talking about the way women's bodies look or the women look in general. Of course, beauty standards, even if we don't call them beauty, apply to men also and people in gay and straight relationships and any kind of other relationship. But historically and in the scholarship on this, the focus has often been on what defines women and beauty for about women, partly because men, as the more powerful people in society, were choosing their spouses. The more powerful their mates, the more powerful the man, the more choice he had. And so it was a situation where powerful men were choosing women, and women were being chosen. So the beauty standard was a way that women worked in that in that sexist milieu. I talked before about high-heeled shoes. This is one way that women modify their bodies and their behavior in a way that is considered attractive, primarily, not exclusively, to men. Women who are wearing high-heeled shoes, it changes the way they walk, changes the way their body moves. It also limits their mobility, which is historically considered attractive. People were not attracted to the idea of a woman being able to run all around. A more inactive, passive behavior was more common. Okay. A little bit more about high heels. The way they change women's posture accentuates particularly the movement around the middle of the body, pelvis and hips, and abdomen. This calls attention to what we call the waist to hip ratio. So the hourglass shape is accentuated by the way people move when they're wearing high heels. They also just basically undermine the function of people's bodies, causing all kinds of damage, long-term damage, as well as the risk of injury. And one of the things that high heels do, and again, it's just one example, but it's something that I've spent a lot of time working on, so I use this example. One of the things high heels do is help establish the difference between men and women, and just creating, taking the whatever differences there are sort of naturally and accentuating them so men and women seem more different. From children to all ages. If you see women wearing heels and men not wearing heels, that's a difference that anybody can notice. Okay, so in terms of the theory of symbolic interaction, high heels are one way that women perform femaleness and that men perform looking at femaleness. Okay. From the feminist perspective, all this is not gender neutral or not neutral at all. It's not just about accentuating certain parts of the body, but also making women literally less powerful, less able to run away, for example, in a way that men have historically found attractive. And if you want to tie this to the historical patriarchal practice in other societies, you can look at foot binding in China, which was something that wealthier families did to their daughters, where they would bind up their daughters' feet very tightly and not untie them, so that as their feet grew, the bones broke and the feet ended up in this supposedly dainty looking, very pointed shape. Women who had bound feet had their mobility impaired for life, but what it communicated from the point of view of the family was, this is, in our family, the girls don't have to work in the fields. We are richer than that. And so that was the desirable quality sort of in the marriage market, to have a woman who had bound feet. If you also didn't want to have a woman who could, do hard labor. So there's a certain connection to high heel shoes here. Obviously, it's very different. Wearing high heels is voluntary. For one thing, it's not something which young girls are locked into before they're old enough to have any say, but there's a socialization element here. And I think it's a fair comparison, at least, to discuss. I showed this the other day, so this is just to reiterate. A lot of people are injured wearing high heels. So before the pandemic, in the United States, something on the order of 40 or 50 women a day were showing up in emergency rooms around the country with injuries that were associated with high heels. So those were usually foot, leg, knee, hip injuries from falling, twisting, breaking, and so on. One interesting thing that we saw, we don't have a measure of how many people are wearing high heels, but we did see, if you look on the graph, a big drop in the number of high heel related injuries in 2020. Either a lot fewer people were getting injured because they weren't going out to parties and bars and so on, or to work and wearing heels, or it's also possible they weren't going to the hospital when they got injured because they were afraid because of the pandemic. But this is an article by me. One of the things I checked was, the injuries more severe during the pandemic? They were not really more severe during the pandemic. So it's not that people with minor injuries were staying home, I think. So anyway, silver linings. One good thing about the pandemic is fewer women were breaking their ankles from wearing high-heeled shoes. Okay. A couple other key points to hit on when we talk about love and romantic relationships. One is homophily. Homophily is just the principle that similar people have more certain kind of contact with each other than people who are not similar. So homophilia is like liking people like yourself, basically. So you can see it in different situations. We use it when we talk about dating and relationships, and especially in the sense of like goes with like, like you see with the common mergansers in the photo. In casual contact, in friendship, in worker collaboration, and in romantic relationships, we see in general similar people end up together more often, just more comfortable, or we can talk about other reasons why that could be happening. When people from the same group marry or reproduce, we call it endogamy. That is, people marrying or reproducing in the same group. The opposite is exogamy, which is gamy is marriage outside the group. And that is what we would call, in the case of race, like interracial marriage or reproduction. In the history of humanity, endogamy is when groups went around and everybody was reproducing within the group. Exogamy was when people reached outside their groups. Exogamy is good for the gene pool. It's good for biological diversity. It's good for cultural diversity. So you need some exogamy, even if people are more comfortable with endogamy. Often. Okay. Race ethnicity is the most obvious case of this, but it's been practiced all the way through human society. And it's interesting that nowadays, when we have this concept of utilitarian love, it often reinforces endogamy. If you're making that checklist of things that you want, it often ends up producing people who are kind of like you, same religion, same live in the same area, maybe same social class background or whatever, unless you're trying to get away from all that. Then you could be making a list and thinking, oh, I don't want to be in my group. I don't want someone from my religion. I don't want someone from my town or neighborhood or a workplace. It still can feed into the utilitarian view. But it's more often the similar person shows up on the checklist. Okay. That's where we are for today. Thank you. See you next time.